Being released from prison can be a jarring experience. Reentry can be difficult under the best of circumstances, but a state housing crisis has made it harder. Add in cuts to mental health services, job assistance, and food insecurity programs, life is getting harder for many previously incarcerated individuals. This is Where We Live from Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Catherine Shen. Today, we're talking about reentry services in Connecticut and the challenges facing the formerly incarcerated. Ahead of this hour, Where We Live producer Tess Terrible spoke with two people navigating life after incarceration. Alpha Jalloh grew up in the South Bronx, but was incarcerated in Connecticut for 8 years. He earned his associate's degree through the Yale Prison Initiative and eventually landed a job after his release. But he says the path to employment was long.
So when I came home, I had my degree. And, I was just used to, my professors telling me, Alpha, you're so amazing. You're so great. You're going to make it when you go home. And then when I came home, just the realities of the world hit me, right? The world was telling me something entirely different. I came home, I got to the halfway house, and I just kept witnessing people going back to prison, right? And before prison, I never had a job before. So all I had was my associate's degree. And I was just like, all right, I got my associate's degree, but I know that I don't want to work at a factory. I don't want to work at a McDonald's. I don't want to do none of that, right? I feel like I earned my associate's degree. I was valedictorian. I feel like, I want to work in nonprofit. I want to work for a nonprofit agency, right? So I applied for about 100 different jobs. I got turned down a lot of times. And I got a job here in New Haven as a career specialist. I specialize working with the unhoused, and there's an intersection of the two, right? So a lot of people who are unhoused have legal involvement, are just as impacted.
Alpha worked for Fellowship Place in New Haven, but he resigned recently to go back to school. In the fall, he'll start school at Yale, joining the Eli Whitney Students Program, which is a program for non-traditional students with exceptional backgrounds. But no two reentry stories are alike, and some formerly incarcerated people can get access to more services than others when transitioning back to the community. Bryan Jordan, also known as Love, spent time in prison alongside Alpha. His conviction was vacated and he was released just 2 months ago after spending 2 decades behind bars. While Alpha was released through a halfway house, Love wasn't. He says adjusting to life outside prison has been a challenge.
So I sat for 20 years and nobody prepared me for society. I'm not computer literate. My financial literacy comes from the street, so I'm not up to speed with banking or mobile apping or, any of these things that will make you successful in the world. The typical person that comes home is released to a halfway house. Those halfway houses have certain programs, and some people are successful because they meet these counselors. They meet people that they have access to resources to get you housing, employment, and things like that, because you are technically still incarcerated. That's not what I did. They released me to the street. So I'm not eligible for any of those services. Whatever I do is through seeking on my own, or if I know somebody that would try to backdoor or cause a favor in or something like that, that is my reentry. But to date, I have not received a single program under the name of reentry from the state of Connecticut. Not one.
Yeah, just to build upon what Love is saying, Love is absolutely right? Like, if you look at my story, you'd be like, hey, Alpha is a successful reentry story, right? And you look at Love's story and be like, hey, Love is struggling right now, right, with reentry. But the only difference between us is luck. Like, when it comes to reentry, there's this whole world of things, right? So, for example, there are mental health issues. People come home, they don't have the family support. There's this, there's this message of, there are all these services. We offer housing. We offer, employment services. But all these services are, if you really look at them through a microscope, they're inadequate. They don't address people's real concerns. I have people that I've worked with, they don't have job experiences. They don't have work experience. So let's say you don't have a job. That could be a cause for you to go back to prison, right? Let's say you lose your job because of a manager who understands that you have a background and uses that against you. That could be you going back to prison because you lost your job. And how could that not break you? How could that not make you feel hopeless?
So if the question is, do I have hope in myself or hope for a future? I've existed 20 years in prison on only hope. of only wanting to have something better and fighting for it and fighting for it and fighting for it and hoping that something will happen. I don't think that part of me will ever leave. I don't know anything else. It got me through some pretty dark times, but I think we're saying that, we're saying the same things. I think we're at different stages in the same on the same path. Now, I was incarcerated with Alpha, so we shared a lot of the same spaces, and I believe we have the same goal in life, and that is to not go back to prison. That's like one of my main goals is not to be rich. So reentry and how you do that, whether it's, help through a friend, through a family, through the state of Connecticut, or, what I'm going through is just like taking it, today was a good day or yesterday was a good day. And I think until as a society, until we demand that we change and pivot where we start reentry, I think you're going to face the same struggles. We need to pivot where we are allocating the funds along this journey of incarceration. And I think trying to do it when a guy is walking out of the door, it will never work. That model of reentry is false.
That was Bryan Jordan, also known as Love, and Alpha Jalloh, who is sharing what their lives look like after incarceration in Connecticut. And joining us now is Beth Hines, who's the Executive Director of Community Partners in Action. Beth, thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you.
And also with us is State Senator Gary Winfield, who represents New Haven and West Haven. Gary, appreciate your time as well.
Thank you. Good morning.
So before we get into the conversation, I want to start by responding to what we've heard from Love and Alpha. Gary, we'll start with you first here.
Yeah, it's very much what I've heard in the years that I've worked on these issues. It's a little bit frustrating to hear because what it reminds me of is the approach that we have to the folks that we have in our system and the lack of understanding of what reentry really should be. I think reentry should start the moment that you hit the prison. I think we should be thinking about these folks as people who eventually will come back and hopefully be successful. But given the way that we've traditionally thought about these issues, tend not to be. And as much as we might want to put the blame on these individuals themselves, a lot of it has to do with the systems that we have in place. So it's very much familiar and at the same time, very much frustrating.
And so we're going to spend a lot of time today going into the details of how the experiences have been, what they can be, and what sort of movements are moving forward. But Beth, would love to know your thoughts as well after hearing what both Love and Alpha had to share. Anything that jumped out to you?
I wish I knew how to reach Love. Mm-hmm. And if he's listening today, we have reentry welcome centers in Hartford and in Waterbury that can help you. And hopefully you can get to one of those centers. Clearly, somebody dropped the ball on Love because there are reentry counselors within DOC who should have connected him to services so that he actually, if he was served in the way that he should have been, he could have come right to the Welcome Center on his day of release. And we could have been prepared for him. We could have talked to reentry counselors, known what he needed, whether it was housing, and we could have been prepared for the day that he came. So that situation is a shame.
And so I imagine that's probably, unfortunately, not uncommon. And
No.
I think sort of building on what Senator Winfield has shared earlier in terms of the process of reentry should start at the beginning. Mm-hmm. So is that something that you're looking into too in terms, because in this case, if Love had that, then he probably would have had services.
Exactly. And so I'm not really sure what happened, but for the welcome centers that we have, we work directly with DOC reentry counselors. And so they will make referrals to the centers, and we will know when that person is coming to us. And DOC will actually bring them right to us. There's times when we have an opportunity to go inside and meet with the person before they're released, which is really best practice, to try to establish that relationship, establish a bond between the participant and staff, really do an assessment of that person's needs so that we can be prepared when they come to us so that the person isn't released in crisis. Mm-hmm. So I'm not really sure what happened to Love. especially since he discharged end of sentence, meaning he had no probation or parole or resources, he is he's really the perfect candidate to come to these centers and get the help that he needs.
Well, and you just kind of gave us an idea of how it all works. Can you share with us a little bit more? What do reentry services in Connecticut typically look like? Is there a, when I say typical, air quotes on the typical, but what does that look like for these individuals?
Sure. So I can speak from the experiences that we have at the Welcome Centers. So Community Partners in Action operates the Hartford and Waterbury Reentry Welcome Centers. And one of the most important things that we do is being there for that person on their day of release, because the day of release can be extremely traumatic for somebody that's discharging from prison, especially if they have no family to go home to, they don't have resources, they don't know where they're staying that night. That's really, really important. And so our staff are equipped to welcome them home, to ensure they have shelter, whether that means a sober living environment. It might even mean a shelter for a little bit until we are able to secure a stable housing for them, such as a sober living environment. There's times when we need to put people in hotels for a few days until those beds become available, whether they're in a transitional home or a sober house. The first thing is stabilization, right? And really trying to avoid any crisis situation. We're very fortunate to partner with a number of agencies, both in Hartford and in Waterbury, that help provide wraparound services to people that come to us. And so while CPA does not offer substance abuse and mental health and primary medical, we have on-site services at the centers. We've got mobile vans that come. We have community health workers that come on site, making sure people are connected to primary care. Those that are in need of mental health and substance abuse services that are connected. We have relationships with Intercommunity, with Community Renewal Team, Catholic Charities, who have been, instrumental in helping our participants meet those needs. And so, and everybody comes to us at with different needs, right? Somebody's going to be, some people who come to us are going to be ready to hit the ground running with employment search. And then there's going to be some that are going to need a lot more time, getting better before they're ready to be able to work and be and successfully transition. So we're there for whatever the person needs. We're there for them for however long they need it.
Well, and Gary, I would love your thoughts too here, because Beth mentioned stabilization, and today we're talking about services that for people who are formerly incarcerated can get, but housing is sort of our main theme here. Can you talk about the trauma that people go through and the fact that they need that stabilization to reenter back into community, and housing plays a really big role?
Yeah, I think housing is critical, but for a second to take a step back a little bit and just think about the overall set of issues that folks are dealing with, right? So if you were to go on a reentry website and go to 211 and look up reentry, if you look at the panoply of things that are sitting there in terms of issues that have to be dealt with, I don't think most people imagine the world for these folks in that way, right? Because we don't really, this is not something that is native knowledge for us, right? So you're talking about food, whether they need to access food pantries. You're talking about transportation, like whether they can get on a bus, because most of them don't have the type of transportation that I have. Identification, we fought for a very long time on the issue of identification and whether they could have identification. And identification links to other issues. And so when you think about, and I could go on for the rest of the time that we're on the show with those types of services. So when you think about being unstable in the place that you're going to call the place where you rest your head or home, and you add all of these issues on top of it, it would be difficult for me. And I'm what I think most of us would consider well right now. It would be difficult for me to be able to figure out how do I maneuver in a society. And that's without ever having been removed from the society. You add on top of all of that, the fact that people have been removed oftentimes for extended periods of time and society's functioning in a different way, there is a ongoing trauma that they're experiencing outside of the prison, in addition to all of the things that they experienced in the prison.
Mm-hmm.
And so, to my mind, we've really got to shift the way that we think about this. We have to stop thinking about this as, oh, those people are coming back, and in some way we have to deal with them, and think of it as part of our understanding of what public safety is. If these folks aren't well, if they're not able to do the things that they need, get a place that is stable to live. I'm not even talking about the greatest place to live, just stable.
Mm-hmm.
If they're not in that condition, then they're likely to recidivate. And so folks will often talk about what the rate of recidivism is and why is it as high as it is and all of that. To me, I'm surprised it's not higher, to be honest with you. So I think housing is critical. And we know that housing has become such an issue right now. If I didn't own my house right now, I'd be scared to death about where I would lay my head. So we've really got to take a different look at these issues.
And so, because Gary mentioned, on top of trauma, there's all of these paperwork, if you will, that you have to wade through. And if it's not in your native language in terms of knowledge, that's difficult for any person to go through anyway, let alone let alone talking about somebody who has gone through all of this traumatic experiences. What are your thoughts, Beth, in terms of that process, and how do we appreciate that better? That there's so much more than just sort of, well, you're out, good luck.
And, and people expect, people coming home from prison to be able to just pick themselves up by their bootstraps and be successful without support. It's so, just for example, the ID issue. I've been with Community Partners in Action for 34 years. When I started, I was a job developer helping people come home from prison in Hartford. And we were dealing with the ID issue then. I remember accompanying people to DMV in Wethersfield on a regular basis, going to the federal office to help people get their Social Security card. So to sit here 34 years later and still have this issue is really, it's daunting. And, you can't even get birth certificates from Puerto Rico. So if somebody doesn't have a birth certificate, they can't get a Social Security card. If they don't get a Social Security card, they can't legally work. It just, the domino effect is significant.
Well, and then we shared a little bit earlier before the show that I started my career covering a lot of very similar topics, and it is blowing my mind a little bit that we're kind of still having this conversation a decade plus later. And so we're going to take a quick call from Steve, who's calling in from New Britain, and I believe Steve has a question for both of you. Steve, you're on the air.
Hi, thanks for taking my call. So I read in a recent article in the Connecticut Mirror about the state withdrawing $1.5 million in funding that they initially had allocated to the reentry welcome centers in Connecticut. And so, question for both guests. What will be the impact of such a short-sighted decision? And then the second one is, how do citizens in Connecticut get lawmakers to put the funding back into the budget?
Thank you so much for those questions, Steve. I think, Gary, we'll start with you here.
Well, the exact impact, I don't know. Certainly, that money is used to provide the resources. So there will be some ways in which those resources will be reduced. And I think, again, because I see reentry as part of a public safety issue, I think it increases the risk to public safety for the short-sighted way in which we operate. In terms of how do folks get us as legislators to pay attention, I think oftentimes this issue for folks who either are advocates or folks who've dealt with it is a very, very prominent issue. But, I used to be an activist on this issue before I was a legislator. And it really seemed like it was ever present. And then as a legislator, I've done some thinking in ways that I didn't used to do. Right? And I think, we often talk about the Black community and how many folks in the Black community have been in our system and a disproportionate nature and all of that. When you really think about the current population in the state and how many people just in that community, the one that we talk about, the disproportionate, how many people, what percentage of people are currently in our system, right? It's a very small percentage of the population. And so to get people to see this as a major issue is actually more difficult than I think folks folks would know, right? You think about trying to get folks to be activated on things like school, where we have a much larger percentage of our children even in there. And so it's a difficult thing. And I think people have to recognize that the work to get us to do the right thing means that it has to be reprioritized. And so folks have to actually engage with us on this. The activists like Beth and company, we know them, right? But folks who are not those people have to come to see this as their issue. And I think too many times they don't when it actually is their issue. It's my concern that folks come out and participate in my community as a full human being with all the things that they need. And if they don't, whether that ever actually directly impacts me in terms of a crime or not, it impacts me because there's something in my society that's just not functioning the way that it should.
So I think it's a very community-based thought processes. And Beth, I want to pose Steve's question to you too in terms of how is state funding impacting the services that you'll be able to provide with the withdrawal of funding, and also how can people get involved to help?
Well, to clarify, the centers have never been supported by state funding. And so, as Gary has mentioned, I have often been at the Legislative Office Building advocating for state funding for not just the centers run by Community Partners in Action, but also the centers that are in Bridgeport, run by Career Resources, in New Haven, operated by Project More. We have a center in New Britain operated by New Life Ministries, and we have reentry services in New London at the OIC. And so this $1.5 million was not just for CPA, and there's been some articles written where it appeared that it was just for CPA centers. This was for the centers statewide to support them. We have all been patchworking our funding together to try to keep these centers open. We've been grateful to the foundations who've supported us and our donors. But now with the ending of the ARPA funds, we have significant gaps in resources. And so I can tell you for Hartford and Waterbury, we have to cut services. We actually paused referrals in July. We needed to assess what our actual funding was going to be for this fiscal year. Without that $1.5 million for the centers statewide. Unfortunately, we have to cut services. We won't be able to serve everybody that comes through our doors anymore. We used to have between 4 to 6 people dropped off by DOC every week at the Hartford and Waterbury centers. We have told DOC they can have 5 a month in Hartford and 4 a month in Waterbury. That's all we can manage based on our staffing levels. And then the rest of the people that we serve will be through walk-ins and halfway houses. But we will probably not be able to serve people on probation anymore. They will have to be served elsewhere. So it's really challenging. We serve in Hartford at least 500 people a year. Our goal is to serve 120 this year based on the resources that we have. Now, if we're lucky and there is a special session and our legislators put that $1.5 million back into that budget, we can continue these centers and we can go back to serving everybody that walks through the door. And it's so challenging when you have somebody come in a crisis and being unable to meet their needs due to not having the resources necessary.
We're going to continue the conversation after a quick break. With us today is Beth Hines, who's the Executive Director of Community Partners in Action, and also State Senator Gary Winfield, who represents New Haven and West Haven. If you or someone you know has experienced reentry, we would love to hear from you. What were the biggest challenges? Let us know. 888-720-9677, or leave us a comment on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. This is Where We Live from Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Catherine Shen. Today, we're talking about challenges facing people who are formerly incarcerated. One of the biggest problems, housing. Landlords are less likely to rent to someone with a criminal record. Formerly incarcerated people are 10 times more likely to be homeless. That's according to the Prison Policy Initiative. And before we get into detailed questions about housing, I do want Beth Hines, who's the Executive Director of Community Partners in Action, sort of finish a thought from the previous segment about how can people be more involved in this process, or maybe the education aspect of it.
Well, just like Gary said, you've got to reach out to your legislators. I mean, if this is a topic that's important to you, if this has touched your life in any way, and I would imagine that for the majority of the population, that it does. Addiction, mental health, reentry, people that have experienced trauma. If these matters are important to you, if you think that people deserve a second chance, then it's important that you reach out to the people who represent you, to the people that have your voice at the legislative office building and potentially during this special session. And hopefully this will be an agenda item for the special session, but it can only get there if people reach out to those who represent them at the legislative level and let the people that are speaking for you know that this is an important issue for you and you want to see this move forward.
And Gary, did you want to go for it?
So one of the things that I found as a legislator that I didn't even realize when I was engaging the legislator in the activist community was how few people interact with the legislature on anything. Mm-hmm. So you make the assumption that because these issues are so important, people are constantly contacting legislators, repining on whatever the issue might be, and that's just not real. We kind of joke in the legislature that if 7 or 8 people contact you, it's a real issue. It's a joke and it's real. Mm-hmm. And so, I think there probably are some folks who sit at home and say, well, they don't need my voice. We absolutely do need your voice because it is very likely that the thing that you think of as important as other people have already done the work, they have not.
Mm-hmm. Well, and Senator, earlier you have mentioned that we are in a housing crisis already. So people who are looking for housing are already having challenges looking for housing, let alone people who are formerly incarcerated looking for a home. So many are saying that there aren't enough affordable housing for the general population. So can you expound more on how is this impacting the incarcerated population too?
Yes, well, certainly if we're talking about folks who, at least initially, are looking for employment and finding ways for themselves, they're probably not people who are in high income situations. They're probably not folks who, even if they get housing, they're going to get top tier housing. And so we need housing that is accessible to them. And part of being accessible is affordability. Also, part of this goes back to just the realities of coming out of the system. Mm-hmm. And so a lot of landlords want to know what your record says. And I've spent enough time with folks who come out of our system to know that can be a really bad thing. I've watched folks both in the employment context and the housing context get access to a record, and what they think they're reading is not what the rest of it actually says, right? Because there are all kinds of ways in which different charges show up, but they may not be the thing that is actually the offense that the person was incarcerated for. So I've always struggled with what we think we know. I think what we know is that this individual spent some time in the system and that they're trying to get their life back on track. But I'm not even sure that record tells us what we think it's telling us. And I think the desire to make the record even more a part of these systems is actually not as good for public safety as we think it is.
And I think, Beth, both of you have made it pretty clear that all of this is very much connected, needing services like job assistance, mental health, and food insecurity. So when someone does fall into homelessness, does it make it harder to get those services?
Well, you should know that housing is the most critical need of our participants, safe housing. Upwards of 70% of the people that come to the welcome centers are either street homeless or housing insecure, mm-hmm. meaning they are in a halfway house or a transitional house, or they're couch surfing, maybe staying at a friend's house. maybe have an option for a hotel night once in a while if they have money. But housing is the most critical need of people coming home from prison. We do have a part-time housing specialist at the Welcome Center in Hartford. She's made some inroads with landlords, but we do find that there's times when we end up not being able to work with a landlord because the housing conditions are not such that we would want our participants living in those environments. A lot of participants we work with live in like rooming house environments where there's 8 or 9 other people that are living in the home.
Right.
So, going back to what Gary's saying, it's not really an ideal situation. They would rather be in their own apartment, but, circumstances, prevent them from being able to get to that level. We have a reentry home in Manchester for women where we have up to 6 women can live in the home. And these are women coming out of prison, maybe discharging from halfway houses who don't have anywhere to go. They stabilize at this home, they work their recovery, they gain employment, they open a savings account, and then eventually the goal is for them to move into independent living. We were really blessed to be able to have a reentry home for men. We operated it for 2 years in Hartford, and we were always full. And I can tell you that we served 28 men in that time frame. Only 2 went back to prison. Everybody else was housed independently, was successful. Unfortunately, the funding came through an opioid settlement grant to the city of Hartford that was not like a long-term grant. And so we knew that it was going to come to an end. It just was really unfortunate. We tried, everything we could to keep the home open. The goal is to open another reentry home for men as soon as we can, as soon as we have the resources, because it's so necessary.
And Gary, because Beth mentioned landlords, and I want to talk more about the role that landlords play here. So as we mentioned earlier, we already are in a housing crisis here in the state, and a lot of landlords don't want to rent to people who have a criminal background. So in February, the New Haven Legal Assistant Association and Mandy Management, which is a rental management company with over 5,000 properties. So there's a discrimination case that was settled when the company rejected a housing application to someone who was previously incarcerated. So Gary, my question to you here is, could this set a precedent? Might we see more landlords open to renting those with a background?
I would hope that it would, but I've dealt with these populations for a very long time. While I have that hope, I wouldn't bet a lot on it. Look, I don't mean to vilify the landlords, because I think in their minds what they're doing is the right thing to do. I think in their minds they're trying to create what they see as the safest environment. I think part of the issue is just in general we are not very educated on the experience of being in prison and what it means to come out of prison, and what is before us in terms of the information we have. So I wouldn't bet all that much that there's going to be a wholesale change. I just want to say, though, because Beth was talking about getting folks to living independently, and I think that is the goal. I also think that we have to be a little bit careful when we talk about that, because I think even though folks are living independently, one of the things that increases the ability to decrease recidivism is a system of continued support. And I think some people, when they hear us talk about living independently, and some people who are in the system doing the work think if you can just get there, then we're good, right? And there are sets of things that we have to make sure that we've built in, right? We need a good risk and need assessment for these folks and the proper interventions to go along with that, so that we just don't know what they need, but we can actually deliver those things. This is all going to cost money, right? Which, to the caller's point, it is short-sighted when we act as though we don't need to put more money in the system and we're just giving away money. We need different behavioral strategies that we don't always have. All of this stuff are resources that we know but don't always put in place. And when the state is moving in a direction to reduce any of those things, we really should be asking ourselves, what does this mean for that population and for our public safety. The housing that we're talking about and that notion of us not being educated enough to see beyond what we've always seen is dangerous.
Well, and Beth, building on what Gary just mentioned here, it sounds like stigma is a huge barrier. And we've talked about education. We talked about sort of having these communications with each other about what exactly is the experience like, obviously case by case basis. But are we starting to see a change in terms of, are people understanding it more? Are people asking more questions? Or what is your experience like since the beginning, I guess?
Well, I can tell you when I first started in this work, we tended to stay under the radar, and what I've seen over the last several years is there's a lot more interest in reentry, which is good and I find positive, but this interest, it would be great if this interest led to action, get involved, like Gary said, if it matters to you, reach out to your legislators, figure out ways you can be helpful to what's going on versus just thinking others are doing the work and you don't need to get involved. The housing situation is significant. And I think that, with the welcome centers really at a place where funding is in jeopardy, what we're going to see is more homelessness. We're going to see more mental health. We're going to see more recidivism. And so right now you have the prison population over 11,000 people, and it's projected to continue to rise. I would challenge by saying with the welcome centers being unable to serve all of the people that they have been in the past years, that number is going to grow at a lot faster pace than what people are predicting.
Today, we're talking about life after incarceration. If you or someone you know is navigating reentry, we would love to hear from you. Join the conversation, 888-720-9677, or find us on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. With us is State Senator Gary Winfield, who represents New Haven and West Haven, and Beth Hines, who's the Executive Director of Community Partners in Action. This is Where We Live. Stay with us. This is Where We Live from Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Catherine Shen. There's no doubt that reentry services are expensive, but so is prison. Here in Connecticut, it costs over $100,000 per year to keep one person behind bars. Today, we're talking about what reentry currently looks like in our state. If you or someone you love is navigating life after prison, we want to hear from you. Give us a call, 888-720-9677, or find us on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. So Senator Gary Winfield, who represents New Haven and West Haven, is with us. Gary, earlier you mentioned recidivism a couple of times. So what do we know how that looks like in our state? How does it compare with the national average?
I don't have the national average number, but I can tell you that in the last recidivism study, OPM has to do a recidivism study every year. In the last recidivism study, we're lower than we were at the beginning of the pandemic, but higher than we were when you mark us against what we use as the kind of base year, which is 2015. So we still have work to do based on where we've been in our state. And that suggests to me that while we've been doing as much as we can, there is much more we can do. And what we know is some of the issues that we have are everything that we've been talking about. And some of the issues are just let's just say they're just plainly political. And I'm not talking about electoral politics. They're political in that it is hard to get folks to buy into doing the things we want to do, because most people see people in our prison system as something other than themselves, some form of other. Either they're poor, or they're for persons of color or whatever the thing is that makes them another. And so investing in those folks is not what people want to do. I mean, I've been doing this work for a very, very long time.
Mm-hmm.
And people are constantly trying to figure out why I'm trying to get us to invest in this. And all of that leads to reentry looking like it looks. I think we have to really change the notion that these people are others. They are people very much like ourselves who find themselves in prisons and jails for all sorts of reasons. And that is one of the things we have to overcome, I think, in order to properly to deal with this issue.
And Beth, I want to talk more with you about the cost in keeping someone in prison, but I do want to sort of build on what Gary just shared here. Are you seeing the same sort of resistance, perhaps, in terms of investing into this community?
Well, we were hoping for the $1.5 million to be invested into the Reentry Welcome Center. So having it removed at the, really at the final hour was really disappointing. So, I mean, where we're spending our money in Connecticut says a lot, and where we're not spending it says a lot too. When you think about how much it costs, and you said $100,000 per person per year, and that's not somebody that has significant needs, right? That's not somebody that has major medical needs or mental health. That's someone that, doesn't really need a lot of intervention. When you look at the reentry welcome centers, we're really talking about between $5,000 and $10,000 per person per year. Mm. So if you can't convince somebody that this is an important issue because the others that Gary talks about are actually people who deserve to be treated with humanity and respect, just like all of us, then maybe we can convince people based on their purse strings, right? And so if we're able to keep 5 or 10 people out of prison in a year, I mean, that's $500,000, $1 million that we're saving the state of Connecticut. And also, those people are getting jobs and contributing to taxes. So it just makes good fiscal sense, if nothing else.
Well, I think it sounds like there's been some changes in terms of the numbers, where if we're comparing sort of present day versus during the COVID-19 pandemic. Can you tell us a little bit about what that looks like?
What do you mean?
In terms of, I believe I think there's under 10,000 people incarcerated, I think at some point, and I think we're up to 12,000 now. Can you give us an idea of what that's like?
Right. Yeah. So throughout the pandemic, the prison population dropped. We all know that. And I think at the lowest, it was under 10,000. Gary, just correct me if I'm wrong. I think at the lowest, we're talking about
we were down under 10.
Yeah, under 10. And so the latest reports I saw are that we are now over 11,000, and the trajectory is to continue to go up. And so if we don't do something, then our prison population is continuing to rise, which costs millions and millions of dollars. And at one point with the agency, we were up over 18,000 people in prison. And so I just feel as a state, we can do a lot better.
Well,
so if I can,
go for it.
Just for numbers' sake, in July of that base year, I was talking about 2015, we're at 16,000 plus. That was a drop off. And in July of 2021, when the pandemic had been at full bore, we were at 9,900 and I don't know the change, right? So that tells you that there was a lot of work being done to reduce the prison population, and now we're headed back towards the base year. I'm hoping we never hit the base year, but we're headed towards the base year.
Well, and sort of still on the topic of cost, Beth, in April, because nearly 400 DOJ grants were terminated, this included grants for reentry services. Is that impacting reentry programs here in Connecticut?
So for Community Partners in Action, we had 2 federal grants that had planned ends. So our federal funding wasn't cut. However, we did receive a significant cut to our prison arts program. We had received a grant from the National Endowment of the Arts. And it was a 2-year grant. And unfortunately, with all of the federal cuts to the National Endowment of the Arts, we received notice back in the spring that we would not be awarded that second year of funding, which was really disappointing.
And does that, I mean, I'm assuming that there's a lot of direct impacts with that.
Absolutely. So, this is our longest running program at CPA. We go into the prisons. We work with people who are incarcerated, who produce spectacular artwork that we then share with their families and loved ones. We have annual shows. We produce journals. It's just a phenomenal program. It's been around for almost 50 years. Really not one like it in the country, probably not internationally as well. But it's a way that CPA is able to connect the outside world to the prison, right, and for people in prison to be connected to the outside world. And so you can imagine how powerful it must be for a person who's incarcerated, a father who sends home to their child an work that they created, expressing their love.
Well, I got a quick question for you here, Gary, on the federal level, because in July, President Donald Trump signed an executive order on homelessness, and the EO included prohibitions on encampments. Will this impact the previously incarcerated population?
I think it will impact the previously incarcerated. I think it will impact the currently incarcerated. And I think it will increase our prison numbers, right? If we're thinking about imprisoning or institutionalizing folks who are homeless, there's no way to think about this other than that the population will go up. I think it's exemplary of the lack of educated approach to this issue. I'm trying to be careful about what I say here, right? It's not a smart approach to this issue, and it will only exacerbate the problem. And I just say this real quick. I know we're about to hit time, but
go for it.
I think that's why things like so to bring up someone who hasn't been mentioned, Senator Saud Anwar, and his attempt to go in and see what's going on in the prisons, that I know in the media has been laughed at a little bit, but I think that's why those kind of things are important. We need to be educated about the experience and how the experience of being inside relates to what happens when we're outside.
Mm-hmm. And just to add to that, final thoughts here for Beth, we got about a minute here, but we talked about education, talked about communication, and Gary has mentioned call your legislators, email your legislators. What else can people do?
How about protest? If that legislative session happens, let's all go to the Capitol and really express what's important to us. It's my understanding the housing bill will be addressed. So we all need to come out, I think, in groves and show the people that are making decisions on behalf of the citizens of Connecticut what's important to us, what matters.
Well, I want to thank
that.
Yep, go for it, Gary. Any final thoughts?
I was just saying I concur with you on that.
Well, we appreciate both of your time and your thoughts today. I want to thank our guests. You've been listening to State Senator Gary Winfield, who represents New Haven and West Haven. Gary, thank you so much for your time today.
You.
And Beth Hines, who's the Executive Director of Community Partners in Action. Beth, thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you for having me.
I'm Catherine Shen. Today's show is produced by Tess Terrible. Our technical producer is Dylan Reyes. Download Where We Live anytime on your favorite podcast app. And thank you all so much for listening.